To my video of Mosston's teaching styles. Individual practice is part of the reproduction cluster. The anatomy of the style facilitates the teacher choosing the content and making logistical decisions. Then they'll give private feedback to students as they circulate around activities. Learners immerse in the task, solo from the peers, and it's independent learning because the students pick the location, posture, and tempo. Teacher are the decision makers in pre and post impact, while the learners are decision makers in impact. This reproduction style does not meet the AC-HPE requirement of cooperation skills. Positives and negatives of this style. Today's current learning environment. Many variations of the style's application can be a pro and a con. Usefulness depending on whether learners grasp the content or not, so it depends a lot on the learners, and it's against the contemporary tide of collaborative and experiential learning. Overall, negative. Explanation of how the teaching style will be implemented in today's learning environment. Potential pedagogies include individual learning, concrete experience learning. Students cognitively understand technical components of forehand shot, then they can practice the forehand against a wall, and the teacher can go around delivering them personal feedback so they can evaluate and refine. Steps in the style. Teacher outlines and demonstrates content-specific skill. Teacher manages students into space for individual practice, and students will then individually practice the task and then refine their performance based on the teacher's feedback. In terms of MICPA considerations, instructional demo to be of the single student, then they're going to practice in a solo level, and then teacher going to evaluate, and then students refine based off that teacher feedback. Here's an example of how individual practice would look. There for the student practicing the forehand shot. This is an example of teacher feedback.
For a quick chat, please. I love the effort that you're putting in. You're really tracking the ball and watching onto your racket. But in the future, I'd like you to focus on making sure you get a full follow through.
Personalized feedback right there. Self-check, also part of the reproduction cluster. As part of what constitutes the anatomy of the style, the teacher will determine the content, the criteria of the content, and then will determine the logistical parameters and post-impact interactions with learners. You're going to direct them, the feedback's going to direct them to the criteria. Impact adheres to the nature of individual practice, but post-impact includes students assessing their own performance against the predetermined criteria that was already made by the teacher. Decision makers, teacher decides content, criteria, and logistics, whereas the students are responsible to make the decisions to adjust their performance as informed by the criteria. And there's the Australian curriculum requirement listed there of learning through movement. There's a multitude of positives and negatives of this style that would be when it's implemented in today's learning environment. The style could facilitate modern technology such as iPads to make the criteria, relies on students to be able to work independently. That's a big reliance on them. Learning limited to content and criteria, so the learning can't surpass what's actually on the criteria. It's against the contemporary trend of collaborative and experiential learning. Explanation of how the teaching style will be implemented in today's learning environment. In this case, we'll use the example of basketball free flow. There's going to be 3 criteria content of lift, lock, and leave. Students can execute the shot, check their performance against the criteria, and adjust their future performance accordingly. The pedagogies that could be used include trial and error learning and directed learning. Steps in delivering the style from a teacher's perspective. Teacher outlines the content, then hands out and distributes the criteria sheets. Teacher engages in conversation, directs students towards self-assessment against sheets. So the teacher feedback isn't going to be outside anything that's actually mentioned on the criteria sheet. Student debrief drill, teacher's debrief drill aligned with the achievement of criteria. In terms of MICPA, the practice phase is the same as the individual phase, individual practice. Student evaluates, not the teacher, and students are going to refine based off the evaluation against predetermined criteria. And here is an example of the criteria that could be used for a basketball jump shot for students to fill in during performance. Inclusion style as part of the reproduction cluster is typified by challenge and choice. So the student's going to pick an entry level of difficulty, immerse themselves within the task, and then assess whether their performance is challenging them or not. The decision maker's responsibility within the style. Teachers are responsible to determine the content, the levels of difficulty, in the planning phase and the logistics, whereas the students are responsible to make the decisions regarding challenge and choice. And there's a connection with the Australian curriculum there of understanding movement. Modern day positives and negatives include potential student complacency, so the students not challenging themselves by their choices. The style is inclusive of student choice, which is a plus, and also a plus, inclusion individualizes learning. In terms of how we can implement the style, in this case in cricket, we could have choices, 3 different crease lines to bowl from, and to place a floor marker down to start the run-up. The challenge of this situation is to bowl from further back from the crease and place the mark on a spot that facilitates bowling rhythm instead of placing the marker back as far away as possible. The potential pedagogies that could be used include differentiated learning and challenge by choice learning. Steps in delivering the style from a teacher's perspective: teacher will verbally outline the purpose of the task is challenge and choice, not skill criteria. Teacher's going to circle it around, prompting, not suggesting students to contemplate their individual difficulty level, and the teacher concludes the task by questioning students on their difficulty changes, completely irrelevant from the technical components of the drill. In terms of MICBA considerations, check for understanding, ask questions regarding challenge and choice. Students practice at starting difficulty level, evaluate their own difficulty level regarding to how challenging it feels, prompted by the teacher. They're going to refine and review the difficulty to a level that will challenge them individually. The net applies inclusion style. Look carefully and let me know your responses in the comments. Style as part of the production cluster. To culminate the anatomy of this style, the teacher is going to present a particular scenario, and the students are going to explore such scenario and come up with many different types of solutions to the same scenario. And they're going to do a self-assessment of responses to determine how useful they are. Within this style, the teachers are going to decide. Teacher's responsibility is to decide one question, as we've said, and to ask targeted questions to unlock diverse learning of the students. The students' role and responsibility is to be the decision makers of the responses and to make sure that they apply creativity in creating as many responses as possible that are going to be useful for them. In terms of connection with the Australian curriculum, and again, this style meets learning through movement, in particular testing possible solutions, so trial and error learning. Positives and negatives. Divergent style becomes null and void if students actually don't understand the basics of the skill to start with. There's diverse learning outcomes, big plus, and the style fosters creativity. An explanation of an example implementation, in this case touch rugby, is that a question or scenario can be presented by the teacher. In this case, how do you get past a defender without getting tagged? The teacher can implement and create and manage one-on-one scenarios, and students explore their responses to the above question. It may be many different options, but there's no wrong answers. Steps in the teacher delivering the style. Teachers, of course, going to pose the question or scenario, pre-plan that, and the teacher completes logistics and task management. And then from there, the teacher prompts students for creativity in their responses to the question. The teacher reaffirms that there's no wrong answers. It's only for the students to decide whether their response will be useful or not. In terms of MICBA considerations, instructional task, in this case demo, is not going to focus on one solution to the task. The practice phase is going to facilitate trial and error solutions, and students are going to determine the usefulness of that solution. Whereas the teacher accepts students' review, as again, there's no wrong answers. Now I want you to read these below scenarios, pause the video, and pick which scenario best applies the divergent style of learning. To describe the anatomy of the convergent style as part of the production structure, again, a question is going to be posed to the students, and the students are going to immerse themselves within the task in pursuit of one response to such question. The decision makers within this style include the teacher as the decision makers of one times response to the question or scenario, so they dictate the climate, whereas the students are not going to have any decision-making power. They're only responsible to determine the one correct response by applying their questioning and rationing skills. In terms of connection to the Australian curriculum, the below requirement of learning through movement is insufficiently met by this style. Positives and negatives of the style. Whether or not the learning objective is achieved, to identify this is very identifiable. One target answer equals a very narrow or non-diverse learning scope, a negative aspect, and it's against the modern tide of experiential learning. Implementation, in this case soccer, so the question, the scenario that could be presented is what is one method to pass the ball to the advantage of your teammate? To facilitate this, the drill is conducted in which students start at one cone, run towards the next cone and receive the ball to the middle passer. Teacher listens for predetermined answer, pass into space, and waits to reinforce when he actually sees this. Potential pedagogies that could be used include directed learning and guided discovery. Steps in delivering the style include the teacher delivers the question or scenario, much similar to the divergent style. Teacher completes logistical and management processes, and the teacher waits, prompts students to hear the one predetermined response, and then verbally reinforces that to the student in the class. In terms of MICBART considerations, practice to identify one predetermined solution, evaluation and review based off whether the student understands and demonstrates that one solution to the question. Pause the video to see a representation of a convergent style. And here are my references.